everyone, and welcome to today's at-home session. Thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to see so many of you. So just a few standard bits of etiquette, which we always start with. If you can remember to keep yourselves muted during the talks, that would be wonderful. You're welcome to keep your video on if you wish, but if your connection's poor, sometimes turning off your video can help. Just a reminder that all the talks are recorded. There'll be time for questions and discussion at the close of each talk. So each of the talks is about 10 minutes long, and then we'll have roughly 10 minutes for questions after each talk. Please post any of your questions in the chat, either during or just at the end of the talk. And today, our committee member, Kimberly Wall, is going to be our Q&A chair for today. So she'll be fielding the questions and putting them to our speakers. If you have any kind of more complex or longer questions, then you're obviously welcome to drop us an email or drop the speakers an email and grill them a little bit more that way. So we have 3 speakers today. We're very lucky to have 3 speakers today. And we've also got another museum 5 minutes at the end. What else to say? There's not much else to say. I think we should kick off. So our first speaker today is Dr. Meaghan Walker. She's a Pratt postdoctoral fellow at Memorial University of Newfoundland. She studies the clothing of labouring seafarers, focusing broadly on British maritime workers in the merchant service and Royal Navy in the 18th and 19th centuries. And today she's going to be talking to us about land and sea, using shipping and mercantile sources to reveal maritime working men's wardrobes in the 19th century. Thank you so much, Meaghan.
Thank you.
Need to stop sharing. Stop sharing. Press escape.
Is that showing? That's working?
Yeah, it's looking good.
Yeah, great.
And you can hear me? Okay, perfect. So to begin, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk about my current research. And I just want to add that I have a couple of QR codes to primary sources in this presentation, and you can access these by holding up your phone with a photo app open. And it should take you to the website where these the documents are hosted. So on the 5th of September, 1863, the 45-year-old steward Thomas Howard of the sailing ship Windfell died of dysentery as the ship traversed the Banda Sea of what is now Indonesia. Howard's effects were inventoried by the ship's officers in accordance with British mercantile law, which recorded 71 entries of 248 items, including 19 shirts, 10 pairs of white trousers, and 11 pocket handkerchiefs. The effects were sold in lots nearly a month after his death, raising about 15 pounds. Around the world on the same day, in the store of Ryan's fishing premises in Bonavista, Newfoundland, James Powell purchased 3.5 yards of regatta and some thread for 5 shillings 1 pence. Despite Howard's death being nearly on the other side of the globe from Bonavista, the small purchases of clothing and related goods in the Outport community give further details to the wardrobe that were recorded due to workplace deaths in British merchant vessels around the world. So why look in Newfoundland for the landed aspect of this project? Well, hopefully I'll be able to expand this research later, but in truth, Newfoundland is an ideal place to start researching maritime dress. Situated in the North Atlantic, next to the Grand Banks, this island has always had an important connection to the maritime world through fishing, shipping, the Navy, and simply its sea-facing communities. Because the colony did not join Confederation with Canada until after the Second World War, Newfoundland was also able to foster a small domestic garment production industry, which included, and at this point, some of this is guesswork, At least 2 shoemaking factories, a ready-made and made-to-order clothing manufacturer, domestically produced Jones Co. sewing machines, alongside what you would typically expect to see in a city like this, which includes your local seamstresses, tailors, milliners, and cobblers. St. John's is also the location of a world-class archive of British maritime labor contracts that Memorial University rescued from destruction in the 1970s. So these records, the crew agreements and official logbooks required by the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen were at their core labor contracts for workers aboard British coasting and deep sea merchant vessels. Crew agreements are the primary contract and include a wide range of details about seafaring workers, including their wage, capacity, age, clues about literacy, nationality, and their broader careers. Logbooks, conversely, were the more qualitative of these documents, where the master was required to self-report the activities of his crew. Significantly, this included very strict requirements for recording workplace deaths. Masters had to indicate when, where, and why a crew member had died, report their accumulated wages and debts, and take an itemized inventory of their effects. These 2 records can provide a snapshot into the sea chests of seafaring workers, paired with a wealth of vital data on the deceased worker that surpasses the census in detail. Thomas Howard's inventory, part of which is shown here, is an atypically complete example of such a report. From left to right, this shows how Howard was treated for his dysentery, to which he ultimately succumbed on the 5th of September. Then on the 7th, a full inventory of his effects were taken, followed by a breakdown of his wages and debts. Uncommonly, a second list records the sale of Howard's effects on September 28th, with the items relisted but organized into auction lots and marked with their sales price. The goal of this process served to both meet the bureaucratic interests of the ship owner, or of the British government, but also to fulfill interests of the master and ship owners by redistributing possessions among the crew rather than it taking up vital storage space in below decks, and to recoup any debts the worker might owe to the ship at their death. Where the inventories show a snapshot into these into possessions of an individual, however, the stored journals at the Ryan's premises in Bonavista reveal the long-term consumption of clothing and clothing components in a community. This is a record of debt, which was repaid in the fall with the sale of processed salt fish. Though this financial relationship is similar in some respects to that of company stores in mining and manufacturing communities, this was not an exclusive relationship, and fishers moved their accounts between merchants depending on who offered better prices. The journal for 1863 shows the consistent purchase of fabrics, notions, footwear, headgear, and ready-made garments, which I've briefly listed here. These were purchased in generally small portions. In the case of fabric, usually by a fraction of a yard or a single yard. Shoes and boots are the most descriptive and price fluctuating items, receiving physical, national, and gender descriptors. Boots and shoes were valued at between 5 shillings to £1.50 to up to £2, with English leather being the most expensive compared to American, and no Canadian leather is ever mentioned. An issue with using these journals to uncover the dress of men, and I think probably a lot of people share this frustration, is trying to guess whom the objects were, for whom the objects were intended. And footwear really clearly illustrates this. Boots were stated to be for men and boys, and these were more numerous than those indicated to be for women and girls. But I think this reflects that shoes which were fancier and less practical were described as for women, and therefore men and women were probably wearing boots neutrally described by type rather than gender. In much the same way, it is likely that men and women both wore clothing made of similar hardworking fabrics necessary for the climate and labor of a Newfoundland outport. However, the presence of these fabrics in a maritime community is more information generally than what we see in crew agreement inventories. So this brings us to the crux of the talk, which is, what do these documents tell us together that they can't tell us alone? The crew agreement inventories, while incredibly rich, reflect the imbalance of power at sea. Howard's large inventory is an exception. Officers usually describe the smaller inventories of typical seafarers with the fewest contextual adjectives. What the Ryan Journal allows then is to infuse these adjectiveless inventories with context from repeated consistent purchases of fabric from a primarily maritime community. These records suggest the kind of fabrics preferred by maritime workers, which were cheap and hardworking, like swan skin, dungaree, flannel, and various cotton prints. They also indicate colors, especially in relation to fabric type, like red flannels, white or print cottons, blue serge, and black Coburgs. They allow a pricing cross-reference because auctions at sea were not only financial transactions, but served social, bureaucratic, and spatial purposes. Further, they of course reveal the women garment makers whose labor in Bonavista was likely unpaid household work, but they also put aside their garment labor to work with fishers to prepare fish for market. The Ryan Journal suggests that one or two women became community seamstresses in 1863, just judging by their purchase habits. And they'd both disappear by 1873. And this is possibly due to marriage, but perhaps because they migrated to St. John's to become professional garment workers. If so, they joined a global workforce of men and women producing ready-made clothing that was born from military slop clothing contracts of the British Royal Navy in the 18th century, among other processes. Growing alongside the extending reach of Britain's mercantile and military empire, clothing merchants met the increasing material demands of European merchant seafarers when they visited, deserted, or were discharged in port. And in time, I theorize that this contributed to the spread of European menswear globally, developing a widespread market for cheap, ready-made, and mass-produced men's clothing. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. It was way more detailed than my research ever gets.
Oh, God.
Okay, so we have a couple of quick questions in the chat, and then I have some questions as well. If people can, while we're chatting, you can put more questions in the chat. So Hannah is asking a little bit about, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the labor of women tailoresses on this type of clothing at this time.
I actually have no idea. I haven't gotten into the labor side of it yet. And actually, Newfoundland is kind of a really interesting women's history market, in the sense that there is a lot of focus on what they did as assistant laborers to the fishing process, and a lot less on what they did as household workers. So there actually isn't a lot of literature about their labor as garment makers, both as not unpaid household workers, but also as like professionals in the city. So when I sort of alluded to I assume that I think there were so many shoe factories and different things, it's because there is basically a few studies of actual factories, and there has been no real study of the garment production industry in St. John's. So that's kind of something that I'm trying to slog through at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that there are
Yeah.
so many different sources, and that one of the strengths of your paper and one thing you're grappling with is this cross-referencing of multiple sources and kind of trying to glean knowledge from all these different sources to sort of paint a picture.
Yeah, yeah.
There's another question here. So Kate is asking, is there any material culture left that relates to the fabric or garments that you have researched?
There is little bits and pieces. I've worked on this off and on for like 10 years, and I sort of switched into the Navy during that period, but so I'm switching back into the merchant service. But when I started working on this about 10 years ago, we toured the rooms in St. John's, and I asked if they had a clothing collection, and they basically took me to the hooked rugs section of the collection. And that sort of reflects the hard labor that clothes go through in both maritime work in general and in these communities specifically. When the fabric got worn down, it was repurposed into other items. And at sea, maritime labor is like really corrosive to garments. So a lot of what's actually motivating ready-made clothes sales in these ports is because by the time they get to where they're going, sailors need to throw out their old clothes and buy new clothes, because salt water specifically, but things like tar and other materials that they're coming in contact with on ship are really hard on clothes.
Yeah, and I suppose that
some,
makes,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Did someone else have a question?
Sorry.
I guess that also means that a lot of items are just simply not kept. They're not collected because they're not available.
And men's clothing has like a rate of attrition in this way that is sort of tricky too. Like when you look at something like the collection at the National Maritime Museum, you get a lot of uniforms, and I studied the clothing of the ratings who weren't wearing uniforms. They were just wearing slop clothes, which was mass-produced menswear, and they have like one pair of trousers. Wow. That reflects that entire population. But and you see that, but yeah, I think there's just unfortunately not the same drive, like the same like drive to sort of save that.
Yeah, and I mean that's an ongoing thing in fashion studies and dress history more broadly, is that there is so much material culture that's
flashy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's changing obviously and has been for decades, but it's still not anything close to. Okay, there's a couple more. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say my favorite thing in the National Maritime is like Nelson's stockings, because it's just so rare that a man's stockings get saved, and you're just like, oh, because they're covered in blood from when this man died. We get to keep them.
Yeah, that reminds me of other items that are collected from sort of famous people. They're not collected in and of themselves as garments or examples of a particular type of clothing. And they're still
very fancy socks.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Kelsey asks, do the records listing deceased sailors' belongings ever record the alterations or repairs to the clothing items?
So no, but yeah, so the officers who take these records, they're very, I think they're pretty begrudging about it. And so the fewer items and the less powerful the men are whose items they're recording typically get the most terse inventories. But when you get someone like a master dying, where the officers might be afraid that someone might come after them for missing items, they do get very specific. So I didn't have alterations, but I do have one master who died, and I think it's actually the same voyage of the Windfell, who they recorded his dirty laundry. Like they specifically marked out what was in his dirty laundry, ready to go to the wash. And I did also, one thing that is missing from all these records is that they were all buried in suits of clothes at sea. So they they don't record what clothes they put the sailors in when they buried them, but I have seen one master's record that did do that. They did point out what they put him in when they buried his body. So but that's something to keep in mind. So I have seen records that are very thin, like no jacket, no shoes, and you have to then think that's because he's wearing his only pair of shoes when he died, like when either he drowned or he was committed to the deep.
Right. I guess a lot of it is sort of archaeological in nature. You're doing guesswork and trying to figure out and contextualize the original situation. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Simon is asking, do you have a sense of a typical wardrobe for British merchant seamen, ideally circa 1840s to 1850s? That's very specific. And how that varied from Royal Navy sailors?
So, so these records start in 1863 and go to 1975, and I've tracked them from 63 to the 1930s. Is when my sample collection comes from. So the short answer to that is no, but from what I've seen from my research into the Royal Navy in the early part of the 19th century and my research here, the typical men's wardrobe would be a three-piece suit with probably multiple shirts, multiple trousers, probably a pair or two pairs of footwear, multiple hats, and usually like some miscellaneous items, handkerchiefs, souvenir items, sometimes books, and different things like that they took to sea. And then how that would compare to a sailor in the 40s. Of course, the ratings uniform comes in the 50s, but the clothing that ratings are wearing is getting more similar to what would become the uniform. So they're not dressing as similarly to working men as they would have been in the early part of the 19th century. They're dressing more distinctly. So they would have already the square neckerchief, like the square collar, the white shirt, and depending on where they're serving, sort of navy blue or white trousers and that sort of clothes.
That's very helpful, actually.
Yeah. Something I'm actually really interested in is the adoption of the Royal Navy uniform, because it comes exactly at the same time that the fishery becomes, or the merchant service and fishery become separated from the Navy. So it's the first time that ratings actually become professional maritime, like military workers. Before that, they weren't.
So it's very formalized into these kind of categories around that time.
Yeah.
Interesting. Hannah, do we have time for one more question, or?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Christina asks, I've read somewhere that the women who would knit the Guernsey sweaters would sometimes knit distinctive cable patterns into them to be able to identify that specific sailor better, to identify a specific sailor better in case he died at sea. Have you found evidence for this, or is it more likely an old wives' tale?
I would say it would be hard to extract that from a merchant seafaring, like a deep sea seafaring record, because I think that would more relate to men who were actually more like Newfoundlanders, who were going out to sea and whose community would expect to recover the body. So that could be true. From what I've seen in how they recover bodies in the merchant navy, it is unlikely that the bodies were recovered. They had to say they tried. So there's actually a rote sort of passage that says we stopped, we hove to, we dropped a boat, we looked for this man, and we couldn't find him, or sometimes but I've never seen them actually recover a corpse. So once they give it like the college try, they get back on the ship and like keep going. But there is a growing fear at this period in the late 19th century, especially with the development of steamships, where there is just like this paranoia that they don't stop at all, that men are falling overboard, or that people are falling overboard and ships are just sailing away because time is money, etc. So yeah, you see that sort of fear reoccur. And so it actually appears in the regulations that they have to do this very specific search for the men before they can keep going, and they have to report that they did it. Whether they did it or not is unknown, because this is, again, it's all self-reporting. Nobody's standing over the mast or tapping the paperwork.
And like we know in all fields, historical records are never tampered with, right?
The one thing is that they do really want the inventories, which is great for me, but it doesn't help me out when they don't, because all I get is like a red pencil that comes back on the record that is like, why isn't this inventory recorded? And I'm like, yes, exactly. I agree.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that amazingly interesting and detailed talk. And
Thank you.
I guess we'll move on, Hannah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Meaghan. That was fascinating. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next speaker now. So our next speaker is Miranda. She has recently graduated from the Dress and Textile Histories Master's Programme at the University of Glasgow. Her research on the 19th century focuses on Victorian dress and society, with an emphasis on corsets, foundational garments, and embodied practice. And today she's going to be talking to us about Shaped by Steel, the mass-produced corset, and embodied practice. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully that is visible. Great. There's always that moment where you're never sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Kat, and I've recently graduated from the Dress and Textile History Lit at the University of Glasgow, where I had the time and space to fully obsess over my favorite dress history topic, corsets. Particularly the transition from custom-made, small-scale production to mass production, spurred on by the Industrial Revolution. I started thinking about this as I thought of corsets in a modern context, and by how often we hear about how corsets can be comfortable. It's just that modern mass-produced corsets aren't. But I started thinking about how the mass-produced corset is not a 21st century invention. Mass production kicked in for a lot of garments as early as in the mid-19th century. I realized how little I knew about these early mass-produced corsets, and so I started exploring. To open, here is a small column I came across from the London Serial-Comic journal, Judy, dated 1878. It is titled, "Of Course It Does," and it reads, quote, "The dress reformers are at it again. There is, it is asserted, in formation a school of beauty, in which the members, male and female, pledge themselves to do all they can to make themselves good-looking by natural means. Prizes will be given to those ladies who can move with ease and grace, and so afford evidence of the free use of their limbs, whilst it will be a leading rule of the school that though stays may be used as a means of support, they shall not be deemed essential as an accessory of beauty. This determines the question." This determines the question. This determines the question. While the present fashion in female costume obtains, it is easy to predict that any crusade against stays will speedily come to a full stop. This passage from 1878 highlights some of the pervasive discourse regarding corsets, or stays, as they were sometimes still referred to in the later half of the 19th century. Dress reform movements started to campaign against the artificiality of beauty and proposed instead that naturally obtained beauty should be the height of fashion. One of their targets was the corset, for they deemed it to artificially construct the fashionable body. However, as the passage emphasizes, the corset was so ingrained in the female silhouette of the 19th century that even dress reformers advocated that the corset could still be allowed as long as it did not restrict movement and served as a means of support. Its role as a device for beauty has been investigated, but its function of support is often forgotten. This positioning of the corset object as a garment of support rather than beauty is connected to the development of the corset in the 19th century, particularly the dramatic shift in its production and consumption, which was triggered by industrialization and made fashionable corsets more accessible. This tale of growth of industrialization in production lines is familiar, yet a reliance upon the Industrial Revolution narrative has celebrated innovation and commercialization and overshadowed the bodily impacts and implications of mass production. The corset was an inherently corporeal product. Not only was it worn upon the body, but it shaped, supported, and constructed the public perception of the body. While bespoke production could embrace the diversity and variability of the human form beneath, the mass-produced corset catered to a falsely standardized body. The shift from a custom-fit corset to a mass-produced corset for an object that is meant as a second skin presents curious dynamics. How did they negotiate making a perfectly fit garment for every woman? In my master's dissertation, I began to investigate the role of industrialization in corset production in Britain between 1850 and 1899, and how the shift from small-scale bespoke manufacture to industrialized mass manufacture affected the corset product and the consumer's experience. My dissertation proposed that the famous R&H.W. Symington & Co. Limited, a corset company based in Market Harbour, as a case study for the British corset industry in this time. Although the company may today be better known for its 20th century underwear and the Liberty bodice, the brand was built upon corset manufacture, and its effective industrialization underpinned its successful and rapid expansion. The Symington Company started out as a family business, which expanded steadily through the first half of the 19th century. James Symington and Sarah Gold, the daughter of a staymaker, married in 1835. Through this marriage, Sarah's skill set as a seamstress and staymaker enabled James Symington to expand his business into staymaking. Industrialization for Symingtons started with the introduction of the sewing machine. In 1855, Sarah and James's son, Robert, traveled to America and returned with a Singer sewing machine. Its early introduction into the Symington workshop was essential in the expansion of production in the company's early days, increasing the rate of output and saving time and effort in the complex and often hard work of corset making. The sewing machine became increasingly popular across clothing production in the later half of the 19th century, creating a booming mechanical market that led to the development of more products. Soon, different variations of the sewing machine were available, catering to specific processes, such as machines specifically for corset flossing or sewing boning channels, called strip work. So the machines were made specifically for corset making to speed up the process. By increasing production and efficiency in the 50s and 60s, the company was able to produce greater quantities and styles of corsets, leading to the diversification of product. A similar development may be seen across the market in the form of corset advertisements, which often presented a dozen or more corset styles from a single company at one given time. Symington's is a prime example of the growth of the corset industry and its shift from small-scale production into mass production. The Symington archive, which includes corset objects, photographs, and patterns, has been essential in my research and provides excellent primary evidence as well as beautiful corsets to admire. So we have a photo here of the Symington factory. Most of the photos from the Symington factories are undated, but looking at the clothes, you could hazard a guess. But it just shows a little bit about the setup in the factory of how corsets were manufactured. And in particular, in the back, I believe, yeah, so this is the cutting room, and in the back you have a cording machine. So it just gives a little bit of insight into how the mechanization of the processes fit into the workroom. And then through investigating contemporary corset advertisements, which increased in quantity and variety as the 19th century progressed, and the Symington Archives collection of extant corset patterns, it is possible to grasp the extensive array of corsets available for purchase. This image shows some of the varieties of corsets available for purchase from one single British manufacturer, H. Hull, Kings & Sons, in 1888. Here, they present 6 different styles of corsets, all named differently, but with little information regarding what distinguishes one style from another. Clues in the description include broad whalebone and side springs for the Princess Beatrice corset, which is the one at the top right. And it suggests a stronger and stiffer corset due to the width of the whalebone and the side springs, which refer to the use of sprung steel bones on the side panels to reinforce the silhouette. The Cleveland bridal corset, the one on the middle on the left, is offered in best silk, while the hygienic corset on the right is targeting full figures these keywords within the advertisement suggested differences between corsets which may not be immediately obvious to our modern eyes, but some implicit contemporary understanding would have been expected from the consumer. So what I was really curious about is that this presents 6 different types of corsets that all look the same at a glance. And so I was trying to understand through looking at the language and the presentation of it, what are the actual differences between these corsets. To further understand the differences between styles, I also compared some extant patterns from the Symington collection by superimposing them through photo editing software. This image shows 2 corset patterns, pattern 31050 and pattern 31300, which are both dated as being produced from 1892 to 1907, superimposed. Although small, the differences between the patterns become more easily noticeable with this method. For example, pattern 31300 has a higher bust line. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but you can see that it has a higher bust across the front panels, which provides higher coverage, which may indicate it was more appropriate for a bigger bust. These minute differences work to create different corsets which cater to different types of bodies. I believe these extant patterns can be more fully explored to further understand the way mass manufactured corsets worked through an embodied practice approach, which I hope to explore in the future. Industrialization was essential in the development of mass-produced corset market. It flooded retailers with a variety of corset models and makes. These different styles were the ephemeral remains of a once bespoke service. Through a surprisingly detailed sizing method, the customer was able to customize their corset to a certain degree, but they were still working to standardized patterns. Although bespoke corsetry was still offered, it remained mostly available to the higher classes due to its more expensive cost. Mass-produced corsets supplied in particular the working and middle classes, providing different models depending on the occupation, body, and pecuniary power of the consumer. I'm now looking to expand this research into a PhD project, which hinges on recreation and embodied practice as valid means of experiential research. My plan is to use the Symington's extant collection as a foundation to form the typical British mass-produced corset, which will inform an academic recreation methodology. By using Symington's own patterns, I will make corset objects following the standardized sizing system and also a custom fit option to directly compare the 2 production methods on the body. This new recreation methodology will provide insight into unrecorded labor practices and experiential wearing of corset recreations to uncover how the Victorian mass-produced corset would have interacted with the moving body. And that's it. I just wanted to thank the Symington Collection and Sarah Nicol, the curator, for letting me display these images and their help throughout my research.
Thank you, Kat. That was fascinating. So let's start with the chat. Hannah asks if you know if Symington's and all other mass manufacturers divided the production work between male and female workers.
This is something I was very interested in. So it was definitely divided. I did 2 kinds of research that helped me identify who produced what. The first was I looked at, so the only time Symington's was mentioned in local newspapers was when they went to court against some of their workers, mostly women, who were stitchers. So it seems that most of the sort of stitching, seamstressing, sewing job was done by women and men were supervising. Another clue is throughout the photographs. Symington has a really great photographic archive of their workrooms, all mostly late 19th century, early 20th century. You can see where women are positioned in the room and where men are positioned in the room, and men are usually at counters. So there's, for example, an image of the patterning room where they have all the patterns cut out in wood and cardboard, and that's all men on the patterns. Couldn't spot a single woman. But then if you move over to an image of sort of, for example, the sewing room where there's just rows and rows of sewing machines, all the stitches are women. So I think there was a very clear separation of workers. Men were mostly in positions of power. And I think also I could see things like there was an image of the packaging room or like parcel room, things like that were men as well. So there was definitely a gendered separation of employment at the factory, which was pretty common at the time.
Yeah, unsurprising, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Suzanne asks, oh, where did the question just go? It just moved. Sorry, just give me a second. Here we go. Does the Symington archive contain any information about corset prices?
A little, not as much as I wish it did. They do have some of the sort of the advertisements that would go on the corset boxes, the actual boxes, and they have some of advertisements of Symington in newspapers at the time. So those do include prices. When I was talking to Sarah Nicol, the curator, she did say that although the Symington targeted the working class, mostly people in domestic service and the lower middle classes, the corsets by comparison were still on the higher end. So imagine the higher end of the drugstore, I guess, is what we're trying to think. They were definitely not the cheapest corsets, even though, for example, one of the most famous Symington corset is the Pretty Housemaid corset, was very clearly targeting women in domestic service, and it advertised as the cheapest and strongest corset. That wasn't necessarily true, but
Would love to know what that means, the strongest. Like, what does that mean? Does that translate into support, or does that translate into stiff and therefore not mobile, which of course wouldn't you want it to be more flexible?
Kind of both. So from what I understand, so corsets that were targeted to working women that would move around a lot and do hard labor, had to have reinforcements. So a lot of things that they did was to add, for example, the Pretty Housemaid one has what they call a busk protector, which is almost like a second busk at the front that would help take some of the strain and protect that first one from bending and breaking. A lot of them would have corset shields that could be added into them, which are additional bones that can be added to the sides. There's a lot of things, inventive things going on in the corsetry industry at this point to add to reinforced corsets. But what I really like as well is the fact that once a corset is kind of finalized, done, there's not much you can do to it in terms of repair or alteration, because you'd have to remove all the bones, you'd have to do a lot of the work repeated. So what they do is they add things to it. They kind of slap on these extra reinforcements where they can, the waist, the bust,
like you would
to make them last longer.
Building. Like you would
Exactly.
like patch up of it. I mean, obviously, with my background in dress reform, I haven't a particular interest in corsetry, but I guess, and I'm not trying to jump the questions. There's a couple in the chat I'm going to get to in a second, but one of my own questions about this is, you know, just this reinforcement of this mass-produced, like, since it's mass produced, it's not made for the body. So I don't think the argument can be made that it could be particularly comfortable. And the fact that it had to be reinforced so that the pressure from the body alone would not destroy or damage the corset gives you some sense of what force was being exerted onto the corset, right? So if it needed to be reinforced, the bending and the normal mobility of the worker would then be damaging the corset, which would make you think that that reinforcement. So it's kind of like a, to me, that signals that it was even more uncomfortable than perhaps we even think. I know there's a lot of arguments about how bespoke and, you know, tailored garments that were made for women specifically, that were tailored to a particular person's silhouette, that these could be more comfortable. But I think this is an interesting, you've probably written about this already. But back to the chat. I'll email you separately. I've got lots of questions.
Okay, no problem. I'm happy to discuss it further.
Okay, so so actually this, you would already address one of the questions in the chat, which was about, did Symington factory have an after sales service kind of area for repair?
That's a really great topic that I didn't have time to cover in my dissertation, but I hope to in the future. 15,000 words isn't as much as it seems at the end of the day. They actually came up with a patented system, which said their corsets had a 1-year guarantee. And they patented this and they sued people that tried to copy it. It was great drama in the corset industry. But they insured the corset for a year, which was revolutionary at the time. So the way it worked is when you went and purchased something for the merchant had a little slip of paper that he filled out, and then he would give that to you. And then if your corset broke, you were entitled to package it up with the little slip, send it off to Symington's, and they would first double check that the slip was right by contacting the merchant, but also just replace your corset, either fix it or replace it if it broke within the year. It was a guaranteed 1-year warranty essentially,
Wow.
which was revolutionary, I think. And they actually took people to court over it because they tried to copy it. But
that gesture to supply another corset, that really suggests that they are anxious to keep clients in the fold.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
I also think it talks about the product. Like they were so confident in their corset, the strength and the construction of their corset, that they wouldn't show it for a year.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Beth asks, were there options for plus size corsets in the same styles as for smaller women, or would there be a completely different style and pattern made for plus size women?
So as far as I understand, there wasn't two different answers here. So I actually was really interested in this because I'm not standard sized myself. So I really wanted to look at what the options were for someone with my waist measurement. And the best way to do this was going through corset advertisements, because the way they advertise them is they tell you the waist measurements in the adverts. So you could clearly see which corsets were aimed at which types of body. It was very common for them to have, I think the most common sizing range was 21 to 28 inch waist. This is the desired waist. This is not your actual measurement. This is the closed corset final measurement. So you'd allow like a 3-inch difference for a real waist there. So that's the highest and most common in corsets, was about a 32-inch waist. But they did have options for larger sizes. I think the largest I saw in the ones that I did see was up to, I want to say 36 inches. I remember circling it in the book and making a note of it because I thought it was really interesting. But then the other thing to keep in mind is that the corset adverts have like a whole terminology, a whole language to them. And they also advertise corsets depending on body type. So for example, there was one advert in my presentation that advertised that hygienic corset, which was for bigger figures. That's not exactly what it said, but full figures. That's some of the terminology that was used, was full figures. So they wouldn't call it plus size because that's our modern concept of it. But even if they don't necessarily mean that a corset comes in this size range, saying something like for full figures, or another great Victorian word that I really don't like is stout figures. That sort of language comes out a lot for the Victorians, and it's not great. But yeah, so you have to keep, there were options, and if you go looking for them, you can either look for the waist size, which is the most common, or the language they use to describe the targeted audience of the corset. So there were options, not as many.
I think it's also important to note, and I came across this in my own research about hygienic garments and supposedly reform corsets and things like that, is that quite often the way that something is illustrated or drawn for the purposes of advertising, as I'm sure you found in your research, doesn't always correspond with the actual dimensions or proportions of the thing that is being referred to. And my understanding of hygienic corsets is that the main difference between them and traditional corsets is that they were more flexible, and that the angle was less harsh, so that if you had a thicker waist, the idea was to allow movement and to allow things to breathe. So the fact that mass production was appropriating that term hygienic, this happened with artistic dress as well. So mainstream fashionable companies would use the term artistic, but then they would advertise the clothing and it would be clearly meant to be worn with a corset, which of course went against some of the artistic dress reform literature in the period. So looking at the advertising and looking at the patterns must be a very interesting and strange place to find this chasm I'm sure you're finding. I think that's all the questions in the chat. I think we're out of time. Hannah, do we need to move on now?
Yeah, I think we can do. We can always return to some questions if we feel we've got time at the end. So thank you so much, Kat. That was fantastic. Okay, so we're going to move on to our third speaker, and that is Dr. Kate Strasdin. She's a senior lecturer at Falmouth University in Cornwall, who's writing a book at the moment, or has just finished writing a book about Anne Sykes's dress diary. And she is, of course, a committee member for the 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed Network. And today she's going to be speaking to us about the blessings of a good thick skirt, the clothing strategies of 19th century women mountaineers. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Hannah. Let's get this up. And it's interesting that this is actually, this is my master's research. When I did the course that is now at Glasgow, before it moved up to Glasgow, and it was at Winchester, this was started as the kind of germination of my master's research 20 years ago. So it's interesting that you come back to things, you might move on and do other research projects, but I think these things that you do stay with you, don't they? And so I'm writing about this again for a different book, and it's been really amazing to revisit this research. And for me, it all started here when I was at Winchester, starting my MA research with this image. And I'd as a teenager, I had done a lot of climbing and mountaineering with my dad, and we used to traverse this glacier in Chamonix, above Chamonix in France. And so I was kind of familiar with this landscape, but also familiar with the idea that when we did it with crampons and ropes and all of that. And I came across this picture in a museum in Chamonix, and it's quite a famous image of tourists walking across the Mer de Glace in 1885. And invariably, the caption that went with this image was always really disparaging. It was always saying, oh, you know, look at these foolish women. Usually it was about the women walking in unsuitable garments across this ice flow. And the thing that struck me when I started my research was more that they were doing it, that they hadn't fallen in. They were striding across these quite large chasms in the ice, and they were successful. And so it made me just think, you know, we talk a lot about the kind of corset myths as 19th century historians, but for me, this became very much about skirt myths and about what women were achieving in skirts at this time. And the idea of women moving in skirts is something that I kind of obsessed over for quite a long time, and still find people send me things. And in fact, this was just sent to me last week. This is an image that somebody bought at a recent auction. They don't know anything about the artist. There wasn't any information. It's just a small watercolor that was painted. It's depicting Penzance, or rather Land's End, in 1862. And it is that notion of women being moving and being active, and far more that what is possible in a skirt. You can see that the overskirt here is lifting to reveal the crinoline beneath, but these are women on the move. They are women who are participating, being active and not passive. So one of the archives that was really useful for me during my research was the Thomas Cook archive, who have a series of really fantastic photographs that started to help me understand some of the strategies that related to skirts in particular. And so it was photographs like this. And in fact, the chap at the back in the middle in the spectacles is Thomas Cook himself. He did accompany a lot of the early excursions, particularly in the 1860s, of tourists visiting the Alpine regions. And this is Thomas Cook with a party of tourists, his first touring party of Switzerland in 1863. And what you can see here is one of the clothing strategies kind of writ large on the bottom third of the skirts for these women. You can see kind of series of creases that runs along the bottom of the skirts. And this shows how they had a kind of Roman blind effect. Anybody that's seen these skirts in collections or general day wear, I mean, not skirts that were specifically associated with mountaineering, but it was a common strategy of raising a skirt. There would be tapes threaded to the inside of the skirt through brass rings, and they would run up to the waist, and then you would pull on the cord and it would raise the skirt. So very much like a Roman blind, and it was a very common way of raising skirts in that way. I should say that the material culture relating to mountaineering clothing, it's almost non-existent, because it was completely ad hoc. Women were just cobbling together really garments to wear for mountaineering that came from standard dressmakers, or garments they already had in their wardrobe that they would adapt and customize. And it wasn't until much later that the idea of a kind of commercialized mountaineering garments actually came to pass. And so you do see evidence of mountaineers at the time who were making these adaptations to their skirts. So one of the most famous mid-19th century mountaineers was someone called Lucy Walker. This is a really awful blurry photograph. It's because it's one of the only photographs of her in her mountaineering dress from the Alpine Club library, but it's very small, so it doesn't reproduce very well. But you can see here that she has taken a slightly different approach, which is to loop up that overskirt by using either buttons or a tape on the outside. So rather than raising it from the inside like a Roman blind, the skirt is raised on the outside and either buttoned, they've got buttonholes and loops that attach outside the skirt, or it's pinned at the waist. Lucy Walker was a really indomitable woman. She was the first woman to climb the Matterhorn, and she did so very quickly after Edward Whymper had made the first descent, the first actually perilous and disastrous attempt that saw the death of some of his co-climbers. So Lucy Walker was the daughter of a reverend, and she climbed incredibly successfully and made many first descents as well, not just the first woman, but the first person to climb a number of peaks in the Alps. And there are records of her. She did sometimes leave her cage crinoline behind. So when they left, this was very normal sort of strategy, which was that women would wear what would look to be sort of standard fashionable silhouette whilst they're in the village. And then as they leave the village, they would remove certain garments and then hide them, usually behind a rock or something. And so Lucy Walker apparently did leave her cage. Often she would stash it somewhere to pick up on her way back. But other mountaineers would record meeting her in far-flung mountain huts. Particularly one recorded her climbing down from the summit of Mont Blanc in a snowstorm, and she was drying her skirts by the fire in one of the mountain huts. And so she did climb in a skirt really successfully. And you can see more of that strategy here. This is a kind of terrifying photograph. It's in the French Museum in Bristol. And this is one of the examples of another garment that women customarily wore on the mountains, which is a face mask to protect their complexion. And I think that what has often challenged people when you think about women mountaineers, it's the, certainly in a contemporary sense, was the idea that you couldn't be both feminine and a mountaineer, and that you had to compromise somewhere along the line. And lots of the women who wrote memoirs or letters, they were in no way wanting to, they didn't see themselves as being transgressive, and certainly sartorially didn't see themselves as being particularly transgressive. And they did want to protect their complexion. So they didn't particularly want to tan, and so they wore these horrifying face masks that I sometimes think of that loomed at you out of the mist. It would give other climbers quite the fright, but you can see that they're also making those alterations, those adaptations to the lower portion of their skirts. And the Tuckett sisters, actually, they wrote memoirs, but also drew these lovely sketches whilst they were out on the mountains. And this is one with the caption that reads, "Excited by finding themselves on the turf, Mrs. C and W take to gambling." And you can see there that skirt is looped up, but also you can see just by this kind of the way that it hangs on the right hand side, there is a suggestion that there's the cage crinoline is worn underneath that, just by the way it's sort of suspended on that right hand side. So it isn't hanging directly down, it has the support there. So although there isn't the material culture that remains to help evidence what these women were wearing, it's often a case of mapping photographs of the women themselves with the way that they're describing their own experiences. And I realised that, for example, this is a picture of Elizabeth Jackson, who was a really stellar climber. And this is a studio portrait, so there is a degree to which it could be artistic license. This is the kind of the ideal mountaineer. But it's still possible, by not writing about the clothing, I think the sense is that it's kind of unnecessary to record in great detail their clothing. It's just what they wore and what they did. And this is one of the accounts of her writing after she made the first winter traverse of a very difficult climb in Switzerland, and she wrote, "Oh, the weary descent of those rocks. They were not only very steep and very rotten, but were much covered with snow in the worst possible condition, and the utmost care was needed to prevent a slip. To make matters even worse, it was by this time quite dark. One of our lanterns obstinately refused to keep lighted, and our only remaining hope had to be continually passed from hand to hand to enable the one person then moving to see where the next step might be." She finishes this account, which was the first ever account that was invited, that a woman was invited to write for the all-male Alpine Club journal. She wrote that it was a most jolly occasion. And she also doesn't write that she did lose 3 toes to frostbite on that particular excursion. And you get the sense as well with somebody like Fanny Bullock Workman, who was a very renowned mountaineer. She held the altitude record, not just for women, but for men as well in the Himalayas. And this was a record of one of the climbs that she made in the Karakoram in the Himalayas. She wrote, "A dozen steps upward brought us to the next yawning ice mouth. This proved less accommodating than the first crevasse and offered no bridge at all. After scanning its 50 or more feet in length with a lantern, the only way appeared to be to jump near its narrower end. How I hated that leap in the dark across the 4 or 5 feet of invisible space, but it had to be done, so taking the plunge, I landed on the ice slant where the guide stood." Fanny always wore a skirt, and I think what is very reading between the lines of an account like that is that you don't wear something that you think might kill you. She was confident enough, although she obviously hated that particular leap, she was confident enough that she could jump across that crevasse and that her clothes would do what they needed to do. Very, very occasionally, I came across some objects that were, if not directly related to mountaineering, at least showed some of the kinds of material strategies that people could make at the time. And this was a waistcoat in the collections of Killiston House, a National Trust property here in Devon. And it's actually it's felted wool, very heavily felted wool. So it's got a very dense and therefore water repellent to an extent outer layer. And then this pierced suede lining, which in essence is like a crude kind of Gore-Tex. It wicks moisture, perspiration away from the body without letting the elements in on the outer layer. And I found all sorts of recipes in things like the English Woman's Domestic Magazine and the Queen for waterproofing, for how to arrange skirts, how to all sorts of different strategies that people were writing into the notes and queries sections of periodicals and getting other people to reply to their questions. Of course, footwear was really important, and the hobnailing was the key element to this. So basically, people bought their own boots that they would wear in. They would just be normal hard-wearing leather boots, but they would then take them usually to the actual hobnailers in the Alpine regions, because it was in the UK. they tended to use cast iron nails, which weren't considered to be quite as good as wrought iron nails in regions around France, Switzerland. And the hobnailing was really important. Different patterns were used. This is a quote from a book on mountaineering by C.T. Dent. And he wrote that the boot nails are a most important part of the equipment. Various patterns are adopted of arranging the nails on the sole. And some different makers would use different patterns to identify themselves as their kind of maker's mark, if you like. C.T. Dent wrote a whole section on mountaineering equipment. He wasn't confident enough about how to write about women, and he did actually recruit the renowned mountaineer, Mrs. Aubrey Leblond, who was in fact the first president of the Ladies Alpine Club, to write the section on what women should wear. And with regards to the skirt, she wrote on his behalf, "Women who climb should, like men, dress in such a manner that they are protected from extremes of either heat or cold. Every garment should be of wool, and the softer and lighter the material, the better. The skirt should be made perfectly plain, except for a deep border of stitching. 3 yards around the hem will be found a good width for a skirt, which can be of ordinary walking length." And I think it's interesting that the Fiddle Museum's ensemble from around this period captures exactly what women were doing, which is that this isn't a mountaineering garment, but it's a collection of different appropriate pieces that have been compiled to create something that would have met the requirements for the kind of extremes that would be thought necessary at that time. That's exactly what was to the point that you had companies like Burberry who began to explore the possibilities of a commercialized garment production. Rather than catering only to male clients, there was a recognition that women were competing and taking part particularly in climbing, and so they were consumers in their own right and produced some really fantastic garments, none of which survive to my knowledge. There is a Burberry archive, and I have spoken to the Burberry archivist, but I've never been able to actually access. I know they have things like ski suits, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think any of their climbing gowns survived. And they used really technical language when they were describing these climbing gowns. So, for example, the fabric for their 1911 climbing gown, which was gabardine and solax. And solax was described, the process of creating solax was described like this. A non-absorbent agent is forced by high pressure first into the raw yarn, secondly into the twisted thread, and lastly into cloth. So it was a way of proofing cloth to make it, but a very durable kind of cloth. So it's technical language, it's a performance garment. And this carried on for another couple of years. This is from their catalogue, Burberry Sporting Dress in 1913. And this is the climbing gown that shows that kilted skirt that the Fiddle Museum example includes, where you could either wear it as a skirt, or you could, the buttons meant that you could create almost like a divided skirt, which they reassured consumers that it ensured perfect liberty and grace of movement. And the way that the language that they're using, it was taking the female consumer seriously. But I would love to have seen one of these in actual real life. So thank you very much. I think the skirt myth is another one that remains to be busted, let alone the Bridgeton corset. And so this is going to carry on into a chapter that, because interestingly, so many things have been digitized now that were not when I first tackled this all those years ago. So I'm finding accounts that I had not seen before. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kate. That was just so awesome. I mean, I've seen you present on this work before, and I mean, like you, I find myself returning to the whole artistic dress, like the thing that I did in my doctorate. I go back to periodically, and there's so many more sources that are available now that I actually find myself thinking I'm going to have to write a different book gonna have to update the book, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, but just before I get to that, briefly, I just wanted to ask you, because I think this is one of those misconceptions that a lot of people have about the skirt in the 19th century. The modernist myth about fashion is that, skirts were regressive, skirts are the 19th century, pants are modern, women became fashionable, they started wearing pants. But in fact, the symbols and the signifiers around wearing skirts versus pants were so complicated in the 19th century. And I think the suffragettes are a good example. I mean, suffragettes in general, even though they were transgressive and progressive politically, they were at great lengths. They went to great lengths to appear feminine, and were wearing skirts, and were not, challenging norms about clothing and fashion. And we tend to think that one's political attributes always express themselves through dress. But in fact, in the 19th century, women were a lot more strategic, and in some ways, they were quite a bit more complex about how they separated fashion from their political. Do you know what I mean? Did you find that?
Yeah.
Well?
No, I did. And I used a lot of the kind of iconography of the suffragette protests in my research, because I looked at how they were moving in, when they're being arrested and they're being kind of wrestled by a policeman, and that it was about movement in the way that you move in a garment, and when you see them kind of kicking out. And so all of these, like you say, this idea that fashion is linear and that it goes from bad to good, and that where we are now is good, and so everything that came before was ridiculous. And also that subjective nature of comfort, because so often whenever I post anything about mountaineering women and women in skirts, was the whole thing about, but it would have been really uncomfortable to climb in a skirt. And there's never any, there just seems to be this very being wedded to the idea that where we are now is the most comfortable place that humans have ever been in terms of what we wear, is just curious notion. And you can see that women, there are great accounts of, there was one woman who used her skirt to spark a fire. So it was really windy, and so she used her skirt to actually shelter herself from the wind so that she could start a small fire underneath it, and keep. So there's all sorts of accounts of skirts actually being really practical and useful.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk more about this, but let's go to the chat quickly. I know we're kind of running out of time, but there's a huge discussion going on about waterproofing materials in skirts, and there's quite a back and forth. So if people want to check out the chat, there's some questions, there's some answers, but it does seem like waterproofing garments was a standard. There were different methods to reinforce fabric, as you've mentioned. Is there anything you found specifically in the literature around mountaineering?
Yes, so there was a really interesting account of a lady who was going to, she was undertaking, she might not have called herself a mountaineer as such, but she was undertaking a hiking holiday. And she was asking about waterproofing a skirt, and she had a reply that was talking about layering. So again, it's very homemade. It's a very sort of, but the technique that was suggested was layering emulsion paint. So a very watered down kind of emulsion, and linseed oil, and also then a quart of boiled linseed oil that you then applied it in layers over a course of a number of days, let it dry in between times, and that eventually you would have this kind of proofed garment.
Right, and I'm assuming also that what women were wearing underneath those skirts was just simply layers of what would be worn conventionally.
And it might be one or two less depending on the decade. And Mrs. Aubrey Leblond, she would actually wear breeches underneath, and sometimes if she was somewhere kind of exposed where nobody was around, she would take her overskirt off. So there were certainly towards the end of the century, there were many changes going on, and certainly in North America and Canada, women were adopting breeches and trousers quicker than they were in the UK.
Yeah, there's a whole body of literature about that. Okay, so fascinating. I think we have to move on though, right, Hannah?
It might be sensible, maybe if you can have a look at some of the questions in the chat, Kate, and get back to people then. And we'll move on to the museum 5 minutes, but if we feel that we've got time and people would like to return to have another chat about some of these questions, then I'm happy to do that as well. So Thank you so much, Kate. And we will move on to our fourth and final speaker, and that is for our Museum 5 Minutes. So today, Dr. Suzanne Rowland, a lecturer at University of Brighton, will share details of the Dress and Textiles Teaching Collection at Brighton University. And this is thinking about highlighting some of those unexpected collections in university spaces. So over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Hannah. I've just put some links in the chat for everyone to the collection at the University of Brighton, which you can follow as I'm talking about the collection. Okay, so the collection was started over 30 years ago by Professor Lou Taylor, and the aim of the collection is to support teaching and research at the university. It's not available to external researchers, but the catalogue is available online, and I put the link here and in the chat. But if anybody wants to see anything in particular, do contact me or Hannah or Veronica, and we'll do our best to arrange an appointment for you. So you can see on this slide just an overview of some of the items in the collection. So we've got magazines dating from 1832 onwards. There's British dress that cover the 19th century. And there's also Eastern European dress and world dress and textiles and samplers. We've got rails with dress, and we've got lots of materials in boxes as well. So that just gives you a very brief overview, and you can see one of the rails there. This is an example of a 19th century dress from the collection, and thank you very much to Hannah for taking this image for me. This was donated to the collection from Worthing Museum, so nothing is purchased. It relies solely on donations. This particular dress is purple and white check on a violet background, and you can see that it has a bustle at the back, a purple velvet inset at the front with these beautiful glass crystal buttons. And it's not in the best state. That's why it was donated from the museum to us for the Dress History Teaching Collection. So this is the sort of thing that we can handle. No one has to wear white gloves to handle the collection, although some museum practices are followed for storage, like we use acid-free tissue paper, and there's lots of air around the rails, and they're covered with cloths and that sort of thing. It's used by students from practice-based degree programs. They're called the fashion and textile programs, but also the undergraduate degree in fashion and dress history, and our MA program in history of design and material culture. Another example from the 19th century is this amazing jacket with fur trim and decoration. This is one from one of the sub-collections. So there are several sub-collections within the collection. This one's called the Love It collection. We've got lots of photographs and ephemera. So there are photograph albums. Sometimes we know who the people are, who the sitters are, and sometimes we have no idea. So there are albums and there are individual photographs. But they're really useful for sharing with students because they give them an idea of how clothes were worn on the body, and about the place of the sitter in society, and about who was photographed and who wasn't photographed, so we can kind of have an idea of social class as well. Here's an example of some printed ephemera. So we've got a 19th century pattern book on the left, with you can see a pattern for a lady's tennis jacket. On the right hand side, there's a journal, The Lady's Companion, which contained a free pattern for a nightdress. And just an example of another pattern within the collection. So you can see this absolute maze of pattern pieces to be decoded by a dressmaker. in 1903. So it just really gives you an idea of the skill of a dressmaker at that time, because it just frightens me to look at that, really. This is probably one of the earliest pieces in the collection, and this is fascinating because it was altered. So it started life in around 1770, and then it was altered between that time and 1830. And this is one of the examples of dress that's been researched by students. So this was a joint staff and student research project led by Lou Taylor, Charlotte Nicholas, Carolyn Dowell, and students at the time. And I've put a link in the chat to this project because it's so interesting. You can see what everybody found out about different parts of the dress, from the sleeves to the skirt, and the fabric that was used to make the dress as well. This is another example of how our students work with the collection. So this was a curation project for second year fashion and dress history students, where the students used a piece from one of the sub collections. So you can see an embroidered panel here, and the students started with that, and then they worked outwards, and they discovered that it was worked by a mother and later a daughter. And, you know, they did amazing research into this family, and they looked into the sewing as a form of addressing mental health issues in the early 20th century. So it was just such a beautiful project and so well done. And you can see the name of the students on the bottom there. This is just an example of how I use the collection in my research, which is all about blouses. On the left is a blouse that Lou Taylor collected in Scotland many years ago. And it's just a wonderful example of a blouse from 1909, mass manufactured, very high neck with supports inside, long narrow sleeves, very cheap mass manufactured blouse. And on the right hand side, about 1912, an example of really very cheap and flammable flannelette blouse, but, you know, imitating a sort of fashionable print of the time. And then we have many collections that are outside of the 20th century. So just one example is the Walter Field and Royal collection. Walter Field and Royal was a textile designer from Manchester. He was working between 1920 and 60, but there's an archive of his paper sketches and patterns, and that they're really rare to have a collection like this of pieces from, you know, an everyday kind of designer. And they're good for context, you know, for looking back at prints from the 19th century and sort of exploring any similarities and how things have changed and that kind of thing. And one of the things I sort of wanted to point out to everyone here is work that's been done by students with the collection and beyond is in mapping where dress history collections are in other institutions in the south, southeast and southwest of England. So this has been going on since 2011. And there's a link here and in the chat so that you can follow on and see all the amazing museums with dress history collections in these regions. So that's my very brief tour of the dress history teaching collection. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was so fascinating. I mean, I feel like I've been to the collection a long time ago at Brighton, but obviously I've missed so many delightful things there. Hannah, do we have time for questions about the collection?
I think if people are happy to stay on and take, yeah, and they have a couple of questions, then definitely, yeah, I think we can take a couple.
So let's see. Nothing specific in the chat, but and actually we are, Hannah, do you want to close things off? We're actually close to I just realized it's 27 past.
Yeah, no problem. If anyone does have any questions about the collection, then please do email Suzanne, email myself, or Veronica. We are happy to field any questions, as Suzanne has said, and help you any way we can in your accessing of the material in that space. So just to wrap up today, just to highlight the fact that if you enjoyed today, then we'd love to hear about your research as well. Don't be shy, get in touch with us. It can be a work in progress. It can be from an academic perspective, from a maker's perspective, just from the perspective of someone who really, really loves the subject and just is keen to share what they're discovering about it. So please do get involved. To do that, you just go to our WordPress website. The URL is at the top of the screen here. At the moment, we have some themes to kind of guide people for what we're looking for. We're looking for themes on menswear, on textiles, on material and archival approaches, on global perspectives, and finally on clothing the virtual. So if you have any research about dress and textiles in the 19th century that you'd like to share with us, then please do go there and put in a proposal to give us a little talk. We're all very friendly, we won't bite, we promise. So it's just now to wrap up, say thank you so much to our 4 speakers today. It's been a fantastic session.